what's the purpose and need for post-Mormon content, do you think? Like, if you were to, like, kind of list out what are some of the purposes and needs for post-Mormon content?
As a content creator or
No,
for
just
the
as
for the
you
audience?
just the ones that you can list, the name for for all the possible purposes and needs for post-Mormon content.
All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of Life After Deconstruction. But it's not just my episode because I'm going to introduce you to one of my friends, Marti Neilsen. We've engaged online for over a year now, right? We started in the restoration table when it was more active. And I just wanted to have a conversation with Marti. I think she's very thoughtful, and there's conversations that I think that are worth having that she's participating in as well. So welcome to the podcast, Marti. Tell us
Oh,
about yourself.
oh, thanks. Yeah, I don't know if there's gonna be a lot of crossover, so if people already know about me, but, I yeah, I grew up a Latter-day Saint, and we had a collapse of belief, my husband and I together, right before COVID, and then COVID, we kind of disappeared as far as church goes, but then I found myself kind of in this online world, and yeah, it's a fascinating online world because I was totally oblivious to it. Like like before, I don't know, September of 2018, I had no idea it even existed. So it's been interesting being here and just trying to learn to move on with my life and um yeah, I don't know what else to say.
Um, I mean, a couple other things I think that people need to know is that you have a podcast.
Oh, right.
Where will you go? Right under the Mormon Discussions umbrella.
Well, I guess I can kind of go into just different phases that I feel like I've been in. Like when I first left, I felt like I was crazy and something was wrong with me. Found Mormon stories, and it was just really comforting to see that I wasn't the only one, and the things that I was going through were normal. And then I did feel like there was kind of this pendulum swing. I kind of went through an angry phase where I feel like the way that the worst part of church where you're demonizing the world and everything about the world because it's not as good as uh, the way the church teaches you to be. Like I felt like that was happening during my angry phase, um, and it uh, just like a flip flop of a lens or something, if that makes sense. And so um, I don't know. I guess I just found myself wanting to kind of come back to somewhere in the middle of being a little bit more objective about the way I view the church, and the way I view even the ex-Mormon world too, um, and not just pendulum swing right back to where I was, only just not believing. Um, so, and then just kind of the idea of like what, uh, kind of, kind of like philosophy type stuff, like what's the purpose of life type stuff. If it's not this narrative that I've been told my whole life, what is it? And there's a lot of people talking about that online. Jordan Peterson's like a big one, and even Sam Harris, I kind of dips into just the idea that you have to kind of um, have some kind of practice that helps you orient yourself. I guess I don't know how to say that. I don't know how Sam Harris words it. So, anyways, I found John Vervaeke too. I really like his stuff. Um, so anyway, it was just kind of like that next step after maybe coming down off of like an angry phase and like, well, how do I have a fulfilling life now kind of a thing? And how do I help others? A huge thing is relationships. Like, I feel really strongly that you don't have to, like, cut off relationships, um, that, you can be resilient in your relationships too. Like, and I don't know if maybe I've had the thought maybe it's just my personality and maybe what I have to offer isn't for everybody because they don't have my exact personality and it's not gonna work for them in their family situation, but it's there are things I've been able to do that I feel like could be transferred if you're willing to do it, if that makes sense.
So one thing that I've noticed is for people that have a very strong enmeshment of their identity with their beliefs and everything else, when they experience a existential faith and identity crisis, everything crumbles on them.
Mhm.
And I mean, I've seen you talk about how people's attribution of meaning to everything crumbles, and so um, they latch on to something trying to find new certainty, and so they politically shift, they philosophically shift, their moral frameworks all shift on everything. And it seemed to me in our discussions that we've had and what I've seen you do and how you participate is there was some of the framework of how you through which you viewed life and made sense of things. It seemed like it didn't all crumble. Is that fair to say? Like you kept some of your paradigms in your framework with regard to philosophy, relationships, politics, and things like that, where some other people, they just have all of that crumble at the same time.
Maybe. I know that the 3 years before the big collapse of belief and I think there's a difference between when I stopped believing, but and that's not even the right word for it. There was a moment where I could no longer honestly say, "I know the church is true." And and I can remember that moment, and then there was another moment where I lost my loyalty to the organization, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. There was a moment where that collapse happened. And the first collapse wasn't like I've identified it looking back, right? And so it's really hard to know. I wish I could have asked that person that day if they would have been honest with me, like, did anything happen here? Or am I just remembering it that way? You know what? It's hard. I remember having the thought of I don't I'm not being consistent. I don't believe in supernatural stuff anywhere except for here where Joseph Smith claimed supernatural events. Like and I realized that I had that difference. Um and I just remember feeling like there's a way I can still participate honestly. But basically I came to the conclusion it doesn't matter. Like that's not the point of church. The point of church is like follow, being like Jesus Christ, you know, like so that part of me I don't think has the language around it has changed, but I still believe that I should become like Jesus Christ. If Jesus Christ is becoming the best version of myself, which is I don't think I would have disagreed with before. I still believe that now.
So remind me what tr- the shift or the trigger was. Was it church history or a shift of belief in God or
It was a gradual thing. Um I was listening to a debate between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson. They were talking about truth. And I don't know what they said, but it made me I was I just remember that's where I was when it happened. Like that's when I had the thought of I don't think I believe Joseph Smith did what he said he did, like literally. I don't think I literally believe that. So that was kind of and then during that 3 years, I wouldn't say it's so hard to describe. I remember just little moments. Like I remember having a moment where I wanted to call my brother who claims to be agnostic and I wanted to call him and talk to him and I didn't feel like I could unless I talked to my husband first. And I'm really grateful that I had that instinct because um this would have been way harder if I had gone down this path without him. Like, I'm grateful that I had the realization, I think the reason I was afraid to do anything until I talked to him first is because I realized that if I didn't talk to him first, it was gonna be much worse. At least
Yeah.
that's my wondering. Um, but, uh, yeah. And then reading Saints is when I realized the church was biased,
So
and
when you read the text and the footnotes and they didn't really fit together and this is polished.
it's just the first time I realized the church wasn't on, like, objective truth side, that they had their own bias. Like, I thought the church was equals objective truth. Even even with all those doubts, like, I still felt like I still had faith or hope, or faith's the wrong word. I still hoped that the church was still the closest thing to truth. And so in reading Saints, I realized that, oh, they have their own bias. And I was like, well, if that's the case, then I in order to get to the truth, I'm gonna have to listen to some critics. So that's when I found the CES letter, and that's when I'd say my loyalty collapsed after reading that.
Hmm.
So,
And did your husband read that at the same time?
I don't think he did, actually. Um, I kinda thought, like, I was talking to him as I was going through all of it, and so I kinda thought he was reading it too, but I found out that he wasn't, kind of after. I'm trying to think of, he was only willing to read stuff from faithful sources, so I think when he had his collapse, it was reading Brian Hale's website. Learning about the Partridge Sisters was, yeah, that was his moment. A little bit different than mine, but
Interesting. But both of your moments were reading from what are considered faithful sources.
oh, sure. Like, I don't think we'd be here had they not published it. So good on the church for being at least that much more transparent, right?
Yeah.
I also don't think it would have happened had I not been reading the original sources and then seeing how they were presenting what. So it was basically me looking at the original source and from my own judgment saying, well, this is kind of what I think is happening here, and then seeing how they were painting it in the Saints. I was like, this, I realized what I found to be kind of the more reasonable explanation was not the same explanation they were painting. So,
Yeah. I experienced that too. Um, at one point, for some reason, I read Doctrine and Covenants 137 on the Joseph Smith Papers Project, and it's a longer revelation than what's in the Doctrine and Covenants.
uh-oh.
And the reason is because they edited out prophecies that Joseph Smith gave that were false.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, yeah. Like in DNC 137, if you look it up on Joseph Smith Papers Project, he prophesies that Brigham Young would go teach to the indigenous peoples in their language, and that multiple of the then currently constituted Quorum of the 12 would go and do certain things and be faithful forever. But that was before the Kirtland apostasy, and they
Oh,
left. And so, like, there's multiple things in the original Revelation that are demonstrably not true, but what got canonized was editing out what was actually recorded.
wow.
Yeah. So
And then probably editing other things that could possibly not be true later on. Like, they probably, like, if it hadn't happened yet,
yeah,
I'm sure they were like, ooh, can't say stuff like
can,
that.
yeah, yeah. Like they're not going to publish the, I mean, you can go find them, the patriarchal blessings of a lot of the early leaders that say really crazy things. Like, I can't remember, it might be Heber C. Kimball's patriarchal blessings said that he would have the capacity to travel to the moon so he could teach the gospel to the people there. in his patriarchal blessing, things like that. You know, we don't we don't learn those in Sunday school, uh, or even
Yeah,
religion or institute classes. But
right.
yeah, well, I was really interested in having conversation about the things that you do and why you do them and what value you find in them. In my my podcast is based on the premise that there's a lot of deconstructive material out there, like to study the things that we've just been talking about.
Mhm.
Um, and then the content out there that's post deconstruction, after you've tried to figure out what everything means, what are you going to do next with your life? um, it seems to me like most of the reconstructive content out there tends to be prescriptive, like the Faith Matters Foundation is prescriptive, or Dan Witherspoon's Mormon Matters, but now it's not Latter day Faith, tends to be a little bit more prescriptive, like this is how you should build your life after.
Mm.
And I wanted to have discussions with people without having it be prescriptive, like this is how you need to do it, but rather have conversations with people about what they're doing after a faith transition, and what are they doing that's reconstructive, so that listeners and viewers can kind of join people in those conversations and then decide for themselves what are they going to do going forward. And
Yeah, I like that.
thanks. And like one thing that you do is you've been involved in these three practices circle groups that are very interesting to me. And I've seen you lean into difficult conversations uh, that most people would experience them as being uncomfortable. And I've seen you um, clearly disagree with people in conversations, um, and leaning into those kinds of things. And it seems to me that a lot of people don't seek that out. They they tend to want to participate in echo chambers,
Right.
listen to content, participate in conversations, only with people that are part of their conceptual framework. Um, so I was wondering if you could first talk about. I mean, I see you do that. Is that accurate? That you tend to lean into challenging
I
conversations?
yeah, yes, and I would say it's because I'm not sure how well I do it, but I know that those are the conversations I wanted to listen to, and, like, it's very rare that you can find it. Um, but yeah, those I'm more interested in having someone defend what they believe in the strongest sense, because what I don't see a lot of content creators really anywhere, and maybe you could correct me, maybe I'm just not thinking of them, but I will say I think it's fair to say the vast majority don't they don't represent the strongest of the other side. Um,
They don't steal man.
right, and straw man, steel man, and maybe it's because they don't even understand. Like, maybe they're not doing it on purpose. Like, I can't sometimes when you throw out steel man, straw man, I feel like it's a it's a way to say, "Oh, see, this is my opponent," and they're not intellectually honest because they propped up the straw man, right? And I don't think it's necessarily that kind of intention. I think it's really hard to represent the strongest opinions on both sides, especially when you don't hold one of those. So it's just not easy to do without someone that believes it in the room with you. So
Yeah, I think of the Pangburn debates with
yeah,
Harris and Peterson, and they both seem to do a fairly good job presenting the strongest argument of the other. I That drew
which is
me in.
probably why they're both um interesting to listen to on their own is because but even then, I don't think Jordan Peterson I listen to him more than Sam Harris, and Sam Harris might be guilty of this too, but I don't think Jordan Peterson is always he'll say the strongest of the other side, but it's only in passing. Like, I feel like there is so much what's the word for it? If I'm listening to someone and they disagree with me, but they clearly articulate what I believe, and then they explain why they don't agree with that, that is so much more convincing. Even if they know it in their head, but they don't say it, it's really hard for me to take them seriously because they're not even addressing the thing I believe. And I really don't think Jordan Peterson's doing a very good job of that, uh, especially when he's talking about more of the anti-woke stuff. Because my guess is that someone that is woke was just listening to him and saying, "You have no idea what I believe." But I do think Jordan Peterson does understand that. I've heard him I've heard him say it a few times. In fact, it's him, um, what's the word for it? I've heard him advocate for, well, for lack of a better word, like marginalized people, and like, if you don't address this, it's a problem. I don't even know how to. I don't know how to summarize. I wish I could remember. He does it so little that I can't even point to the place where he did it. You know what I mean? But he is part of the reason I've moved left is because of some things that he's said that I'm like, that's true. Like, for example, if you have inequality in your society to the point where it's unstable, then that's a problem. Whether whether the people at the bottom are there because of their lack of trying, or which is uh oh man, actually I won't even say lack of trying because I don't think that's really the case. But I do think that sometimes people look at what they don't have. If so for example, I could be angry because I am not as rich as the wealthiest people in this country, but I just don't have that mindset. But it could cause instability, just my mindset could cause that instability. But the point I'm trying to make is that if you have a huge inequality, that's going to happen more than if there's not a huge inequality. Um,
Yeah.
sorry, I'm
Oh,
really having a hard time.
no, this is good. I think about that too. I think about um, the perpetuation of problems in lower socioeconomic class. So you get someone who their parents don't really participate in their education, their level of literacy is lower. By the time they're in fifth or eighth grade, they're so far behind everybody else that they're likely to be among those who drop out of school. If
Hmm.
they drop out of school, then that in high school, then that diminishes their economic opportunities.
Right.
Um, and then they perpetuate the cycle because they have kids maybe sooner, uh, or multiple kids, or maybe if the woman gets pregnant, after the first or second one, she decides to have an abortion over the third one or something. And it just ends up being a cycle of issues. Um, and education supposedly supposed to be the public education is supposed to be the thing that provides opportunity so people can raise socioeconomic class, like an equalizer of opportunity.
Sure.
But sometimes people start so far behind that they don't. There'll be some standouts that are able to do it, but it makes it very difficult. And then you get a system where, um, with globalization, robotics, technology, access to capital, leverage, and things like that, that um, the entrepreneurs, the investors are able to, double their wealth every 7 to 10 years, or even shorter periods of time. And over an extended period of time, when you add that, we end up today with significant disparities. Um, and it's true that some kid, born to a mom that has 3 kids and there's no dad in the home and she's working. I mean, there are going to be some standouts that are going to fall in love with reading Harry Potter and they're going to learn how to read and then they're going to be able to increase their socioeconomic status. But that seems to be an outlier. And then you get into the circumstances that we're in, and how do you fix those? How do you address the problems? I don't even know how you fix them, because
Right.
I don't like bureaucracies. I don't like government bureaucracies, and I don't like corporate bureaucracies either. Um, uh, and so you debate these unanswerable, like, how do you solve these problems? Because the more the disparity, the more the disproportionate influence, power, the more you end up with the MAGA movement, right? You have a lot in the middle class that have been hammered for decades, and they're absorbing. They were the ones that got hurt the most. The middle class got hurt the most in the financial crisis. They were the ones who lost their job, had to cash out their 401ks. So when the market rebounded, they didn't get the rebound. They were the ones who lost their homes when they lost their jobs. They are the ones where health insurance for a family used to cost $400 and now it's like $2,800, which suppressed their wages. And so a lot in the middle class are going to be angry. They're going to be angry
Hmm.
at immigration, globalization, you name it. Um, but I don't know that that's going to change anything.
Right.
So, because it just gets people elected to blame it on the millionaires and billionaires on the left, and then to blame it on the government on the right,
And the elite class. Hmm.
yeah, and yeah, that's tough. I didn't plan on having this conversation, but I think it's relevant to the overall. What do you do with your life, and what are the things that you're interested in after you go through a faith transition? It's part of
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
right?
No, it totally is. And there's certainly paying attention isn't a bad thing, right?
Yeah. So you have these three practice circle groups. Talk a little bit about what those are like.
Yeah. So um David Osler actually introduced me to that organization, and he, for a while, for several months, we tried to do our own three practice, Mormon themed. So our framing questions would be something like, "This is why I left the church," or something, and we tried to invite both sides to come and participate. Um, they weren't well attended, and so David Osler decided to move his time resources to other projects, and I just stayed and hung around with the bigger three practice group, and went through my ref training. And I, as a ref, I think, to tell you a little bit more about the organization, I think so Jim Henderson and Jim Hancock, they had thought about starting the organization as a nonprofit, but they decided that they want something that benefited people enough that it was worth paying for, that it would self-sustain. They wouldn't have to ask for donations. And so they market it to organizations. So like if you're in some management and stuff, they use it as a tool for management to be able to have someone go through training, and then, and within organizations, they can have conversations. And so they look at it as a tool. And so they teach people how to use this tool. And then people pay to go through training, ref training. And so because I went through that ref training with the help of David Osler, I already had the training, and I really like the idea of personally participating with people that disagree with me. And it's probably like a 9-to-1 ratio as far as political leanings. So most people that are there are left of center and would identify as left of center, maybe even more than 9 to 10. I'm definitely the most conservative one that is regularly um, posting circles. And so personally, that's why I participate. I feel like it's important to not be in echo chambers. So that's my effort to just self-improve myself. Um, Learning how to listen to people that disagree with me. And um, yeah, and it's a pretty powerful tool. So the 3 practices, actually I have a script right here. I can tell you what they are.
So when
The
you
first,
post a circle, you're announcing a Zoom meeting, basically,
right. Yeah,
with a
and you have to
topic and a question.
right. And so if you go to threepractices.com/upcoming circles, you can go see the public ones that are available and you just register and yeah, and then you can join the conversation. Um, but the whole point of it, this is the point of 3 practices is to practice these 3 things. I'll be unusually interested in others, I'll stay in the room with difference, and I'll stop comparing my best with your worst. So anyway, they're way better when you get some it's really cool to see in action when you have actually 2 different viewpoints in the same room, and that's when you get to see how good the tool works, and I it's pretty cool. So,
So it is like a street epistemology tool where you're talking about
a little bit.
where you're at, what would cause you to move one way or another, or
Not quite. It's a little bit it's a little bit more free flowing than that, but then at the same time, it's a little bit more structured. So more free flowing in that the topic can be whatever the volunteer decides to talk about. So
so
someone will volunteer to
give us an
respond.
example of one that you really enjoyed doing.
Um, so the one that I did that had like 20 people show up was something that I'm curious if people on the left even think about. And since most people that come to those circles are on the left, I was like, well, let's find out if they think about this. But it's left extremism. When does the left go too far? And um, so someone would volunteer and they'd respond to it, and they'd once their time's up, then it would go to everybody else to ask a clarifying question. So one thing about one thing about the structure is that you can't have an argument with someone because the only thing you can do is volunteer. Someone can ask you a question and you answer it. But you can't, if you didn't
You,
answer it in the way they wanted,
you
they
don't
can,
rebut.
no. And so it really does bother people that are wanting an argument. Sometimes I think we'll get first timers, and I think that's what they think it is, and we never see them again. So, and after you come a few times, you start to realize, oh, this isn't about changing minds, although you will change people's minds by participating in more subtle ways. Like it really helps me to just see the humanity of people that disagree with me. It's like, oh, they genuinely believe this and they are doing it because they really think this is the right thing to do. So even if I think it's pointing, if everybody thought like them, we'd go the wrong direction. At least I can see the humanity in them and it's not like they're evil. So, which is really good. And then also sometimes you get clarifying, you can ask a clarifying question and you actually realize that you don't disagree that much. Like you're having a problem with the definition of a word that you're using or something like that. Like that's happened before for me.
And you lean into these conversations, you enjoy these conversations because of what it does to your mind,
Right. Well,
or you like to watch
so
the dynamic.
when I'm the ref, I'm the one I'll hold up the clock and I'm kind of guiding the conversation. That's where it's more structured. So it's free in that people can say and ask whatever they want, but it's structured in that the volunteer has 2 minutes and then someone can ask a clarifying question and then they have 1 minute to respond. So it's timed. So you can't go off and off and off and on and on. Like you only it's timed. And if I cut you off because you ran out of time, someone else can say, "Hey, I'd be curious to know if you had another minute what you would say." So like you can offer people more time, but it's structured in that like you can't yeah. And you'd be surprised, you only usually have time for 2 or 3 volunteers to respond to the framing question, and the hour's up in like 2 seconds. Like,
Hmm.
I mean, I say 2 seconds, but that's a funny phrase right there that I
So
just
it
said.
goes, yeah, it goes fast.
Let's
Um,
go.
so what, so what do you, the people that come back to the conversations, what do you perceive they get out of this engagement?
I think they're genuinely like very curious people. Like, and then it's a little bit of a community too. Like I know a lot of the people that are regulars, and it's just fine, nice to see them. I think so. There's a community aspect. I think that's kind of happening. I don't know if that's the purpose of it, but that does seem to be happening.
And how does it, your participation in this, how does it affect your in-person relationships?
Oh,
What,
you it definitely helps. In fact, I think that's if I'm any good at interviewing, I think it's partly because I participate here. Like, I'm able to try to be curious. Like, I am actually practicing curiosity because one thing that you kind of learn when you go to them, like you'll try to frame a gotcha question, if that makes sense. You're trying to ask them a question with I starting with I'd be curious to know, but then you still try to like weasel in your whatever your motive is, right? Which is fine. You can do that if you want, but it's really hard to do. And it's actually easier to just try to practice to be genuinely curious, like where you're asking questions, trying to figure out why they think that instead of why they don't think this, if that makes sense.
hmm.
Does I don't
Yeah, it
know if
does.
that, yeah.
What, tell me about the age range of the participants.
Um, I'd say older. They seem to be more like close to retired. There are a few, there are probably a couple that are younger than me that are showing up. Um, Trying to think. Yeah, probably average age is somewhere like upper 40s, 50s, something like that.
Interesting.
Um, the other thing that's fascinating to me is that I am probably on the opposite end of belief politically and religiously. A lot of them are Christian. So that's interesting to me.
That is interesting. So one thing that goes through my mind is we've both read Jonathan Haidt's Coddling of the American Mind, right?
Yeah.
And for those who don't know, the college experience is very different than it used to be. Like when I was in college, you you wanted to go to a lecture of someone who had an opposing opinion. It was interesting. You didn't like protest
Mm,
that someone you disagreed with, came and spoke at school. And the purpose, I had one professor, he was a Spanish professor. He told me that the purpose of your undergrad was to learn other people's point of view and be able to defend it. And his opinion it wasn't until you were in grad school or at least finished your bachelor's degree that you had a right to your own opinion.
mm,
Um, and and when I read Jonathan Haidt's book, uh, as well as what I see happening on campuses today, it's a very, very different environment where people feel like words are violence
hmm
as opposed to just different opinions, and they feel like they need to cancel and shut down opposing opinions, which I think contributes to the divisiveness that we have today in our culture on social media, cable TV news, and things like
Yeah.
that. But
And our unwillingness to like have those hard conversations too.
To
right?
engage,
Like,
yeah.
yeah, to actually disagree with someone, especially if you value your relationship with someone at all. Like, you really don't want. I found out from my sister-in-law. I was talking to her about what it was like for her kids to be in high school, and she didn't even know. My niece, according to my sister-in-law, she didn't even know what her friends thought about some of these hot button issues. She didn't even know what her friends thought. They don't even ask each other. They don't even talk about it. She has no idea what their opinion is on like LGBTQ stuff or anything. They just don't ask each other or talk about it.
I don't understand that because they're afraid that it'll alienate the relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. So like um yeah, and then the other thing is they just don't even know, like maybe they identify as something or something, so they just don't talk about if they have um anything less than like a 100% nothing's wrong with LGBTQ, anything like anything goes. Like if you have any kind of skepticism at all, like you would just don't say anything.
Hmm.
So
That seems like that'll be a problem in 20 years when they're in the workforce or before then.
yeah,
If
yeah,
if people can't engage in conflict or difficult conversations or differences of opinion.
yeah.
Interesting. So so
It
you've done
seems
your,
it seems to lead to like really superficial relationships too, right? Like how can you have like a deep relationship with someone if you can't even say something that's on your mind a lot, you know?
which would seem to correspond to what's considered an epidemic of loneliness and depression,
Mm, yeah,
right? Because you don't have, I think not having authentic, meaningful, vulnerable conversations and relationships contributes to that sense of loneliness.
yeah.
It's an interesting observation. So tell me about the other things that you're interested in these days and what you're working on.
Well, I don't know. I'm sitting here debating whether to keep the podcast going, so that's going on in my head. I have I have 3 recordings that I have to get out, and I'm excited to share them. So I don't know if I need to change my process of, because what I usually do is I re-listen to them and I clip out stupid stuff like that had no content, or if I misspeak or something like that and I have a 10-second like I'm sorry I just misspoke. Like, you know what like I just cut stupid stuff out. Um and then I obviously put my bumpers on it for the beginning and the end, but yeah, I don't know what to do. I don't know, like I honestly, maybe that's a good segue into some stuff that I want to ask you. Like, what's the purpose and need for post-Mormon content, do you think? Like, if you were to like kind of list out what are some of the purposes and needs for post-Mormon content?
As a content creator or
No, just as
for the
you,
audience?
just the ones that you can list, the name for for all the possible purposes and needs for post-Mormon content.
That is a big question.
Well,
So,
it I actually wrote a list down. Let me make the
oh,
screen
good.
a little bit smaller. And I kind of want to brainstorm a little bit because this might help me decide if I'm gonna continue doing it.
Okay.
So, okay, one is like entertainment and just a pastime, right?
Yeah.
Like another thing I thought of is just filling that need of like tribalism or confirmation bias. Like just, I, I mean, I'm not saying this is a need, but I think this is the purpose of some content is to compare the best of like ex-Mormon thinking or ways or with the worst of Latter-day Saint. like ways of being, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um,
So to feel like,
just to feel like
to
I'm
feel
right. I'm in the
yeah,
right place.
I'm justified because I'm in the right place. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, there's definitely educational, like so learning something new that you didn't know. That's
Yeah.
definitely there. Um, breaking news. There's definitely people that keep up on like new stuff. Learning, seeing something from a new perspective, I think is definitely in there. I was trying to think if is there self-improvement in there? I don't see a lot of self-improvement in I can't think of anything off the top of my head that like seems to fit. I don't know, maybe a little bit inspirational, maybe
Yeah.
motivational a little bit.
Yeah. I see some relational content information.
That's true.
Initially, I wondered when I entered the post-Mormon space, I wondered why there was so much demand for discussions about sexuality. And then I realized that there's a lot more dysfunction out there that I didn't realize existed in sexuality and sexual relationships,
Huh.
not only in marital relationships, but the sense of shame or guilt
Uh,
from traditional atonement theology and then what was taught to individuals by their parents or their leaders about sexuality that ended up causing a lot of dysfunction.
yeah, yeah.
And then they go through their faith crisis and they feel like they want to test behavioral boundaries. So now they're adolescents as 30 to 50-year-olds testing behavioral boundaries while they're processing the grief of a faith crisis. Uh,
Yeah, it's pretty wild, huh?
it can be very, very messy. Yeah.
So that reminds me, we got a book when we got married that was called And They Were Not Ashamed or something like that. And it was a Latter-day Saint author that basically tried to help you through the good girl syndrome and stuff like that. They had a whole chapter on just like, hey, we understand that it's not like a light switch for a lot of people. You can't just all of a sudden say, hey, it's really, really bad. And anyway, it was just the if I had that problem, it would have been a good book to read. Like,
Yeah.
light switch was just fine for me.
Very good.
But anyways, um,
Keep going.
so yeah, I was just trying to think if there was anything in that because I was trying to think of content in general, like when you see content online, and I was trying to see what the purpose, if there's anyways, critiquing of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is definitely one of the purposes and needs, I think.
Yeah.
Connections, making connections or kind of finding a community. I've noticed that Mormonism Live, people jump on there all together and there's like a little community in the chat. Kind of the same thing with Chris's channel. I've seen that starting to happen there too. And I'm sure that's happening on other channels that I'm unaware of. Um, and then just to create content to share with others too are some things that I thought of. Yeah. Am I missing anything? What else can you think of as like the purpose and need for post-Mormon content?
I mean, what I think of is my estimate is that on average about 3% a year of otherwise active believing members are going through some sort of faith transition. Um, and so a ward that has 150 active members, maybe there's 4 to 6 a year people in that ward that go through it. And my
There,
sense, go
go ahead.
ahead.
Oh, that just reminded me of something Bill Real said. So, so in a sense, kind of reviving old content, keeping alive something that is old for someone that left 5 years ago, but might be
New to the
new,
new person.
someone just leaving because it's not a static viewership.
Correct. Yeah. So my sense is over the next 10 to 15 years, there'll be more than 1 million current believing members that are going to go through a faith transition in the
Where,
Rocky in the Rocky Mountain states and the Pacific states.
So that's your estimate. Where did that come from?
I I think active membership of the church worldwide is probably 5 million plus or
No,
minus.
your percent of people having a faith crisis. What are you basing
Oh,
that off of?
um, mostly it's anecdotal, talking with people in different states. Uh, I mean, I spoke at a event in St. George, and and there were some women that came to it that lived in a small town near Cedar City. I think it's Enoch. And in a period of like 6 months, like there were, I think, 6 families that left that ward.
Hmm.
So that's probably a lot more than 3% in that ward. Um, but my faith crisis happened 7 years ago. And so what I've been watching happen in our local stakes, and then what I've been talking about with progressive Mormons and post Mormons in other places, um, as well as asking people that have been in this space a long time, like Lindsay Hansen Park or John Dehlin or Bill Reel's been around a long time,
Hmm.
to get a feel for what the percentage is. And it seemed that it's about 3% a year, um, that are
Do
going
you think
through it.
that'll maintain though? Like,
I think it's compounding.
do you?
Yeah.
Oh wow. The reason I say that is because as soon as the church becomes a little bit more open about their history, and I think they're already kind of doing a better job teaching the full history, like in a seminary institute, I don't think that generation is going to struggle as much as my seminary institute generation. That makes sense.
Yeah. I had
Like
two.
I think it's still going to happen, but it's it's a lot easier. Like my loyalty crashed because of I the sense of dishonesty that I had, like that they weren't being fully transparent. So if they become more transparent and you don't ever have the initial loyalty loss, like maybe they can maintain some membership that way. Like I honestly, to be dead honest with you, as long as they're okay with me being honest with what I really believe, I could I could participate. I think. I don't know. Yeah, I think I could. Like I wouldn't be the Relief Society president or anything.
Yeah.
But like our local ward, they're not sure what to do with us because a lot of them have had family members that have left, and we've been told by some of them that we don't act the same way as some of their family that has left. They're like, "Oh wow, that's really good that you're not so angry that you can't still hang out with us." Or they'll say things like that when we go to activities and stuff. Um, so
Yeah.
go
I've
ahead.
seen shifts. When I went through my faith crisis, there's, I was told by both my bishop and my stake president in separate conversations, when they said you should come back. I said, well, I'd be happy to come back if I can participate and make comments, or, if there's something that I feel helpful to, um, and they asked, well, what would be an example? I said, well, for example, the story of Jonah, in studying biblical scholarship, I've learned that the story of Jonah is a beautiful satirical allegory that was written by some writer to push back on narratives that God could only care about the covenant people. And it's a really beautiful story that, you know, that Jonah could be pissed that he would know that God would forgive the non-covenant people if he went and taught them. And I think if we try to focus on the literal historicity of the story and try to make sense of a man living in a fish for 3 days, like, we have totally missed the purpose and the beauty of the story.
Hmm.
And both of them independently said, um, to suggest that the story of Jonah is not a literal historical story, that would be too stretching for our members. You couldn't
Mm.
do that. And I'm like, okay. So I wasn't even going to mention that if I was in a lesson and we were talking about priesthood restoration, to unpack the scholarship of what priesthood meant in biblical times, as well as the
Mm.
history of the messiness of the history of the narrative of priesthood restoration, that no one knew about it until 1834, you know, um, because there's no way that they would be okay with discussing that history. I probably would be policed if I mentioned Doctrine and Covenants 137, like I mentioned earlier, right? That what's in the Joseph Smith Papers Project doesn't match what's in the canon because they edited it out, the prophecies that were demonstrably false.
Unless it
Um,
was like a specific lesson that was on the tough stuff, right?
yeah, no,
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have the urge to rock that boat. I really don't, because I feel like the information's out there, people can go get it. But I am interested in maintaining like a social fabric. And I feel like the organization that the church has as far as having a having a congregation set up by geography, you know,
mhm,
it's like I'll tell you what, I have a huge head start on knowing my neighbors than someone that just moves in that is not LDS and doesn't go to church. And so I just kind of, when I left, I guess one way I feel like I'm looking at it from where I'm at is like, well, I already kind of know a bunch of my neighbors and I'm going to kind of maintain that. So I'm going to let them see me every once in a while. If they invite us to a summer barbecue activity, I'll come and I'll catch up and let them know I'm still here. And, like I just don't
yeah,
like that's cool that they organize stuff like that. And they're always inviting everybody that will come. And so we've just been willing to show up and not to make them feel uncomfortable, just to be part of the community, be part of the neighborhood still.
yeah. So I would say that over the last 7 years, my ward has changed
Since
um,
that conversation you were describing
since
before.
that conversation.
Okay.
Um, one of the one of the people in our Mormon Spectrum support group, uh, who went through his faith crisis around the same time as me, um, almost decided to resign. Uh, but for some reason, he decided that he wanted to try going to church again.
Hmm.
So he did, and we supported him in that. And he met with our bishop, different bishop, because there were changes since
Hmm.
my faith crisis. And he basically said, on a spectrum, there are some people who believe that scriptures are like a fax machine from God, like speaking through men like they're sock puppets, and every word is from God and it's literal history. And then there's some people on the other end of the spectrum where scriptures is entirely metaphorical. And if there's history in it, it's just like ancillary to the metaphor. And he said, on this spectrum, I'm right here. That's where I am.
The bishop said that.
This is where my friends in our group said to the bishop.
Oh, okay. He
And
said that to the bishop.
he said to the bishop, he said, so if I can come and participate in a Sunday school class representing myself is I don't believe this stuff more than metaphorically, then I would like to come. And over a period of discussions, uh, the bishop said, yes, we'll support you in that. We know that that will be stretching for some of the members of our ward, but the leadership will support you in participating. And
That's
now
cool.
he's in the Sunday school presidency.
That's awesome. Well, I really do think that if you can present what you think is what you think and it's not how it is,
Yes.
this is something I learned from this source. And maybe you say what the source is and say that this is something I learned and it made me think of it like this and it adds to the lesson in some way. don't think people are bothered by that. It
Yeah,
might
like I could
it
say
might make a small percentage uncomfortable, but
I could
there's a
talk about
small yeah, go ahead.
Jonah. Yeah, so I could talk about Jonah without saying it's a satirical allegory. I could just say, hey, when I read this story, I just find this really beautiful, expression by the writer of this idea that God could love the non-covenant people,
Right.
right? And and who are we to say no to God because we're going to be pissed if God forgives the non-covenant people?
Right.
Like, and I could do it that way.
Yeah.
Um, it was probably harder to do when I was early in my faith transition. Um,
Yeah.
so I think
Maybe that's why we're able to have good relationships with our ward members is because we were forced to stop going to church during that same time that we would have been going to church and just like burning inside. Does that make
yes,
sense?
yeah. So you wouldn't you whether it was literally or not literally, you wouldn't have said Jonah is a satirical allegory, because you've processed enough of that where you could have a conversation now and just say, "This is a beautiful story that I find meaning in,"
Right.
and it would be okay. So my ward has shifted to be more accepting of people like my friend in our Facebook or in our Mormon Spectrum support group.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so so I think, and you've seen some of this in some of the places that we're both exist online, that there are people that are shifting with the degree of their literalistic belief,
Mm-hmm.
and there are some that will welcome those people into the conversation, and there are others who will retrench and be defensive because they want to excise the near enemy of the non-literal believer from the group. You've seen that.
Yeah, who do you think that is? I'm curious if you're referring to someone specific.
I mean, we both had a conversation with Jacob Hansen, right?
Mm-hmm.
And and I don't think we're speaking out of turn when we say Jacob wants to cleanse the church of the progressive believers,
Politically progressive though, right? I
religiously progressive too.
I don't think he thinks I'm progressive. Like I think if I asked to go join his ward in the way that your spectrum group person
Yeah.
was, I don't think he'd be threatened by that.
Um,
I
so
I'm speculating.
yeah,
We'll
no,
have to ask Jacob
I mean
to comment.
we can ask him, but I would tell you
Who is he? Now
he's a
he
different person in
there are some
person.
beliefs that I don't hold that I know that are held in that building and I would respect it though. For example, I don't believe the prophet talks to God. Like in fact, that's probably of one of the most sacred held beliefs that Latter-day Saints hold. That's probably one of the ones that I think is I can't see it as a good thing other than one thing, and that is to have a final say so that you have some coherence, group cohesion. What's the word for it? It's a paradox, right? Like
Yeah.
without someone being able to say, this is what we believe, you're going to have so much fragmenting, you're not going to have a group anymore. So that's where I can see the importance of it. But as the the dangers, like it's too bad it's not more like Judaism where you have the practices that kind of hold you together and there's not like some mouthpiece. Like there are other ways that groups have cohesion without having like a final say, like I just think it's so dangerous to have a prophet because the second that that mantle is placed onto somebody that's crazy, you have a good chunk of people that aren't going to realize that that person's crazy and they're going to follow him. Like, and I don't know. Maybe there's enough
Like that Jesus
protections,
cares
but
about the word Mormon, kind of thing. That
that's we haven't had anyone do anything scary that I would be scared of, I don't think, because they're so careful to just maybe there isn't one person making the decision. Maybe it is the whole committee of them and they just claim it's one person. I don't know, but
Yeah, I don't know. So my experience with Jacob and yours, I think also is that when you're having a in-person conversation or a video conversation like this, that's different than Jacob on Twitter.
I'm not on Twitter. That's probably why I'm
Oh,
not I'm not
uh, well, if you've watched some of his episodes, he doesn't like Faith Matters Foundation. He doesn't like Julie Hanks. He doesn't like
I
Patrick
have
Mason.
yeah, I have watched some of those, but wouldn't you agree that all of those people that he's got in his crosshairs are progressive politically or no?
Uh, so I think that whether or not they're progressive politically, his concerns are about doctrinal purity. I think.
Trying to think. When I've watched him,
I mean,
right,
I'm a social
right. So
libertarian, so to him that's liberal.
so for example, he's going to get after Julie Hanks for saying if you don't want to wear your garments, it's not a big deal.
Correct.
Okay. So um and if someone was drinking coffee and they said, we'll just drink coffee and keep coming to church, he's going to say they shouldn't be able to go to the temple. You're
Right.
right. You are
Yeah.
right. So I would not be able to fully participate, but I'm willing to accept that, but still participate in the level that I can. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So
Like
I've
I'm also not going to donate 10% of my money
yeah,
ever again. That I,
correct.
of course, 5 years ago, I would have said that I'm always going to donate 10% of my money. So never say never, I guess. But
Right. I
I'd have to have like a totally different
I
view that I
joined
have.
I joined a book club. Sorry to cut you off.
You know, it's a rambling.
I joined a book club that about half of us are former believers and about half of us are believers. And we read or listen to a book, and then once a month we get together and we talk about it. And that's been really enjoyable. And some of the believers are somewhat, I mean, they have some nuance, but they're pretty orthodox believers. And that's been really enjoyable.
That's
Um,
cool. And
and
this is
I,
in person.
an in-person book club, yeah,
That's
here in
awesome.
Billings, Montana. And I hope that more of that happens. So what I think, kind of back to the discussion that the thread that we were on, is I think it'll be a million. And whether it's a million or half a million, it's going to be a lot of people. There are a lot of people that are going to, even reading like you, Saints, which is supposed to be more transparent,
Hmm.
people will read original sources uh,
Still lose that
and the
loyalty.
footnotes, and they're going to go, they're spinning a narrative here. This isn't entirely transparent. Um, I lost my faith reading the gospel topics essays. Um, and I found the gospel topics essays misrepresenting some of the information in the footnotes and in the cited sources. Um, and that plus recognizing that my spiritual experiences had proven unreliable because they confirm the truthfulness of false things or
Hmm.
counterfactual things is what triggered my faith crisis. So so when I think of whether or not it's a million, there'll be a lot of people that are going to go through a faith transition, I think, um, during the next 10 to 15 years. And I think that you're an outlier where both you and your husband went through it at the same time. More often than not, I think that people will go through it at different times than their spouses or kids. And so I
Yeah.
think there'll be strained relationships and things
Right.
like that. And so the question, I had a conversation actually with Patrick Mason last summer. I went to a meetup where he spoke, and I asked him afterwards, I said, I told him, I said, I think about 3% a year going through a faith transition. And within the next 10 to 15 years, probably more than a million people are going to go through this in the Rocky Mountain states and the Pacific states.
Hmm.
And my question for Patrick was, are is the Big C Church, so Salt Lake City and the Brethren, and the Little C Church on the local level, are they going to minister to those people? Or are they going to retrench and, cleanse themselves of the near enemy of the non-literalist believer kind of thing?
Mhm.
And Patrick's answer was, I think you're right. Uh, that's probably what's going to happen. He says, but the answer to your question is, I have no idea, Anthony. I don't know whether they're going to minister or whether they're going to retrench. And I replied, probably both and. And he said, yeah, I think we'll see both and. And I think we see that. So I think we see things like President Nelson's recent talk about not being super divisive. And then we see other talks, including by him in the past, that were pretty divisive. And I think we see wards that were like the context of the ward that when I went through my faith crisis 7 years ago, I started asking about the gospel topics essays because I had never heard of them. I couldn't find anyone in my ward who had read them. And just for asking about the gospel topics essays in 2016, there were members of my ward that started referring to me as the apostate back
Mm.
then. I don't think that would happen today. It wouldn't happen today in my
Yeah,
ward.
instead it's me saying I'm the apostate.
Right. Yeah, right. Right. And so I think that there'll be literalist believers and there'll be more nuanced believers and there'll be some things that we get from the brethren that are very divisive to protect the fold, and there'll be some that are very conciliatory and trying to support people through the process. And as part of the bigger picture, I think the question, at least the question for me, is whether it's hundreds of thousands or whether it's a million, there are a lot of people that are going to go through an existential crisis, and they're going to go through the difficulty of an anger stage and a burn it down stage, and they're going to go through the complexities of mixed faith relationships with their parents, their kids, their spouse. Um, and the question for me is, do I want to do I want to participate in the ministering? Probably is the wrong word because that makes it sound like I have something that other people don't have, you know. Uh, but I want to participate in that journey. Um, if I can, if I can share something that was helpful for me, so I wouldn't be angry anymore, or if I can share something about how I navigate my mixed faith marriage and that provides some value, or when I did my TEDx talk, to walk people through the experience of an existential uh, dark night of the soul faith crisis in such a way that it would be safe even for a believing member to watch that so that they
Mhm.
could better understand what some of their family and friends have gone through. To me, I find meaning in participating in those things.
Yeah.
Um, and sometimes I feel like I'm burnt out, like I want to be an XX Mormon. That's, you know,
Here, here. That's
yeah.
what I'm trying to decide.
Do I want to be an XX Mormon? And I don't even know that that's possible, particularly if you live in a community of Mormons or if you have believing family and some of
I
your
don't
closest
know.
friends.
I feel like I'm getting a taste of it. It
Are
could,
you?
like, it's not that it disappears. It's not that it's not a thing anymore. It's just it becomes this thing. We've got a really interesting dynamic in our cul-de-sac. Um, I don't want to necessarily share publicly, but it's just we've got a lot of different kinds of people. We had a pretty um, we had a tragedy happen within our neighborhood last summer, and that brought us together in a way I think that um, made us all feel like we were there for each other too. our kids all play well together, but then we've got some people without kids that are still kind of part of us. Like, I don't know how to describe it. It's the kind of neighborhood you'd want to live in. And not everybody's going to the church on Sunday. And I think that as a member, that's what I wanted, right? And I didn't know how to foster those relationships from the inside of the church, but I found it to be kind of a cool opportunity to do it from the outside. And it and the willingness for the members in my area to participate in that has been awesome. Like, I think a lot of times we give Mormons bad rap for having superficial relationships and not deep ones because it's just this going to church every week or whatever. It's not that the want isn't there. I think that we just don't know how. And nobody knows how, really. I think relationships are hard. I don't think it's hard showing up authentic, right? And showing people all of your, hey, my house isn't clean, or yeah, I probably yell at my kids more than I should, or just showing up with your real honest self. Like, authentic, I feel like is overused to like mean something that I don't understand. But when I say authentic, I mean I'm being honest with you. This is what I am. This is what I'm struggling with. This is what I want to become. And I'm going to let you in and let you realize how not close to where I want to be I am. And maybe we can help each other and learn from each other, you know? And is it making sense at all? I'm kind of going off. I'm rambling again.
Yeah, I mean, I couple comments. One is there's a challenge really doing that at church because it seems like the majority of Sunday is about belief affirmation
Hmm,
rather than, I mean, there are exceptions, of course. But it seems like the majority is about belief affirmation. And in 2 hours that aren't a full 2 hours because there's a break, like how in depth really are you going to get into a vulnerable, deep conversation about life and struggles and desires and pains and
sure.
things like that?
But you
Um,
certainly have heard those talks and those talks where people do go there, or a
yeah,
lesson, someone that gives a lesson that does go there, where they actually spent time preparing the lesson and they do take you down there.
yeah,
Like the and it opened, like, I have been in some pretty good lessons where the room opens up to that and then you get comment after comment after comment and you just start to realize, like, yeah, we're all struggling with this thing, just because one person was willing to open up and be a little bit vulnerable and be like, hey, I struggle with this or whatever. And then all of a sudden everybody realizes, okay, for one, I'm not alone. And oh, here's some ideas that might help, you know, like, I'm not saying it happens every week at church, but it certainly happened. I wouldn't want to take that from the practice of learning in a group setting like that. And just being with people that want the best for you.
yeah. Um, I mean, of all the people that are going to go through, that have gone through, or that are going to go through a faith transition, um, I think a lot of them are just going to want to, use substances and party and live in adolescence as adults for a really long period of time. And that's what their choice is going to be.
Mm,
And I think there are some people who are going to want to reconstruct meaning, have these kinds of conversations, philosophy, spirituality, secular spirituality, things like that. And I think there are some people that are going to want to be like my friend in our Mormon Spectrum group, and they're going to want to, or like me in the book club, that we're going to want to turn around and engage in our community uh, because they're a part of our relationships and our formation,
hmm
um, but not do it in a way really that's a belief affirmation participation, but it's still authentic and it's participation.
hmm
So when you ask about content creators, I think, and that was an oversimplification of a spectrum, but I think that there's going to be demand for content across that spectrum. I think there's going to be, ex-Mormon Reddit will grow. Deconstructive material is going to grow. Um, like you mentioned, Bill Reel said there's new people coming into this, and even though we did episodes about the gospel topics essays 3-4 years ago, it's totally good for a new content creator to do a refresh
Right.
series about the gospel topics essays because there are new people coming in.
Mhm.
Um, but I think there's going to be more demand for other kinds of content, and I see this in the post evangelical Christian environment because I see what Brian McLaren is doing with his book "Do I Stay Christian?" And his
Did
book
you
"Faith After Doubt."
Okay, so I that's interesting. I don't know who Brian McLaren is, except for there was a three practice live thing about is Christianity worth saving? Did you hear about that by chance?
Well, I didn't hear the live, but I listened to the book.
Um, well, no, there was so there's a book with the same title.
It's "Do I Stay Christian?"
Oh, okay. So Jim Henderson um, and Jim Hancock organized a live, I think it was they had one in Seattle and one in Portland with Brian McLaren as one of the panelists. And so they did a fishbowl. So not the whole audience couldn't participate with the three practice. So it was a fishbowl. So only the panel could take 2 minutes and ask questions. But they did basically a three practice circle live with Brian McLaren. So anyway, sorry, that's a little side note,
Yeah,
but
I'd suggest both of those books, "Faith After Doubt" and "Do I Stay Christian?" Brett Hartley, Janice Spangler, Bill, and I did 3 episodes on "Faith After Doubt" on the Almost Awakened podcast.
okay.
That I think that was I enjoyed those conversations. But um, in our Mormon Spectrum group, we're in there are a number of people that are increasingly engaging with what we're alluding to now in terms of uh, being at a place in our own journey where we go and we engage with or draw people into engagement inside the church, even though we're not literal believers, in such a way that it's not adversarial, but we can renew those relationships.
Hmm.
You know, whether it's a book club or whether it's going on hikes or camps or planning elders quorum activities.
Yeah.
Uh, and so I think there'll be demand for that. When I think of the content creators, I think there'll be demand for many of those things. I think Bill's podcast umbrella, and I think Dylan's open stories. Um, like there's this saying that if you want to catch an elephant, you get in front of it and dig a hole, and it'll just walk right into it. And if there's hundreds of thousands or a million people in the next 10 years that are going to be seeking deconstruction, making sense of things, mixed faith relationships, philosophy, sexuality, um, and reconstructive conversations, like there are going to be hundreds of thousands of people that are going to desire that.
Mm.
And the question is who are going to be the content creators that are going to do it, and is the church going to is on the big C church and the little C church, is the church going to push people into those content creators and groups by not providing more nuance uh, on the local level or on the church level, or are they going to minister to those people? And and I don't know that there's a really good answer to that, because I'm sure that they have the data that when one spouse goes through a faith transition, a very high percentage of the time the other spouse follows,
Mm.
within the following 10 years. And so if you validate, this is my thought on it. If you validate mixed faith marriage, if you give a general conference talk that says um, having a spouse that loses belief isn't a good justification for a divorce, uh, and if you give conciliatory talks and themes about mixed faith relationships, um, that's helpful because I think it will result in less heartache and pain and less divorce and broken families. But at the same time, if your purpose is to protect the heritage and reputation of the church and strength of belief, that's going to be counterproductive. Because if you can prevent that from happening, then you're going to save more people from losing literal belief. So it seems like someone would have to feel that it's more important to minister to the one, it's more important to help people navigate these things than it is to protect the faith and try to prevent people from going through a faith crisis.
I I don't know. They're between a rock and a hard place. I don't I don't have an answer for them because yeah, I just don't have an answer for them. I do think though the way that we've been treated, I don't think it's abnormal. I don't think it's like we're in some kind of special kind of ward where they haven't ostracized us or anything like that. So I think there's a lot of people that are navigating these relationships in their families. And so this isn't their first rodeo anymore, like it was maybe 10 years ago.
Yeah,
That makes sense. Like it seems like somebody knows somebody. Even and that to me, that's changed even in the last 3 years.
that
Because
more people know someone who's gone through a shift in faith.
I would say when when our collapse of belief happened, I can only think like my brother, when he got back from his mission, didn't participate for a while, but then he ended up marrying a faithful. They didn't get married in the temple, but they still. I think I mean I would have called him less active, but I mean he's still positive toward the church, like and he's my agnostic brother. Um, and then my um only other so then we had like someone that knew somebody that left. And now, knowing what I know now, I understand what it was, but they just suddenly stopped going to church and then they moved away and they just cut themselves off. Like that's what it felt like from the person that we knew. That's how they described it. And I'm like, oh, I know what happened there.
Yeah,
And then, and they couldn't understand it. They couldn't understand how someone just suddenly had no testimony anymore. Like it was just so sudden. And then we had my husband's coworker that we were friends with in Colorado. Like he had like three coworkers that were Latter-day Saints, and so he knew them a little bit better than the others. And one of them left the church, and so he was like, "Wait, what? That's crazy." And so that was kind of this bizarre thing. That was probably the closest person. But now I feel like some people didn't have that, and I feel like almost everybody has that. Or maybe I just feel like everybody has that because they know me, but it just seems like there are more people that are having someone that's not one removed anymore. It's like they know somebody, whether it was a good friend, a sibling, a parent, child, they know somebody that has had like not just the fall away before they ever had a chance to go on a mission or get married in the temple or whatever. Like not that kind, but the kind that They were doing all the things, checking all the boxes, and then just suddenly stop. More of those are happening, I think.
I think so. I think social media plays into that to a certain extent. When I went through my faith crisis in 2016, there were not very many people, three or four who I could think of, who just stopped attending. They were on ward or state council level kind of participation,
Right.
and then they stopped. Um, and I couldn't make sense of things. Uh, and I think just in the last 7 years, a lot more of that has happened. And so I agree with you that most people either have a friend or a family member who has gone from believing to non believing.
And that doesn't really even count the number of people who haven't voiced where they're at. Like we were pretty vocal about where we were at the whole way. Bishop knew where we were at. My family knew where we were at. Like we had a baptism coming up, so we were really pretty upfront because we wanted basically to warn people, hey, if we don't baptize our daughter, this is why. And and then we hung on long enough to do it. It's just how the cards fell. But um but yeah, we told everybody really early on. And I know there's a lot of people that don't say anything. They keep it to themselves for a lot longer than we did.
I've
But
had multiple people tell me that came to me after and said, "Hey, I know what you're going through. I haven't believed for a decade or something," and I had no
mm,
idea, but they went anyway
no, we didn't have any of those.
with
I
like a believing
I
spouse or something like that.
I thought we would. I had when we were going through it, I was like, "Oh my goodness, I'll bet this brother and this brother are on the same page as us. They just haven't said anything." And so then I go and I talk to him, and then I was disappointed at the time. Right now, I'm okay with where they're at, but at the time, I was wanting to not be alone.
Yeah,
And
yeah, I
so I
empathize
remember
with
in
that.
my head, I was like, "Oh, I'll bet you this person's like just hasn't told anybody," and then we were wrong.
So I'm
So,
interested in your thoughts on the whole content creator thing. So I think there'll be demand, and the question is, do you want to be in? Does someone want to be involved in those conversations or topics, and for a period of time or a long period of time? And for some people, they maybe have enough affinity that they can create intellectual capital like Bill, and it can be their job, right?
mm, yeah.
And
Well, this
so
kind of
what
goes back to why I brought it
what's
up
your
in the
take?
first place, because if I personally, my thinking on this is that you have positive content and negative content. Positive content being that I think it improves the life of those that watch it and participate with it. And then I think there's negative content that um, it does the opposite. It does not improve the life of the people that watch it. And to a certain extent, I think entertainment falls under that negative. Oh, shoot, entertainment. If I'm gonna say neutral too, there's neutral content, right? Where it's just time waster. Like I'm just watching this because I have nothing else to do and it doesn't really make your life better or worse. But then there's negative content too. Um, I would say there's a good chunk of content out there, and I'd say this in the political world and um, everywhere online, where someone will watch it and will get the most views, and so it's created. And I'm not even necessarily blaming anybody for this. I think it's just this thing that's happening. And I'm not sure I want to participate with this. How do I word it? This automatic behavior. That's how I'll put it. It's like this not thinking algorithmic kind of content watching. Does that make sense? Like it's not like you got on here and you said, "Man, I want to know how to have a good relationship. I'm going to Google relationships Mormon ex Mormon or something." And that's what you're looking for, right? But
It's
instead
what the
it
algorithm puts in your feed so that you can
that's right.
spend the largest volume of it.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's what is going to get the clicks and then what and I'm not saying that things that get the clicks are necessarily negative. It's not what I'm trying to say, but I'm kind of wondering if I mean that's the game you're playing and so is it worth maybe trying to, you know, get in the algorithm and try to produce positive stuff, you know, like where hey, this might be a little clickbaity, but I think it's gonna have a net good on the people that watch it, right? Like maybe you try to play that game. Um, I don't know. But anyway, so I've been trying as far as like what I think a good aim in life is, it's like I'm not sure that a good aim in life is to be a content creator. Like how am I helping the world by just creating some content? Like I don't know. Um, is that making sense? Like that's what I've been going through. Like I just there's a lot of echo chambery type stuff that is just if there's anything good in it, it's like maybe 1/10 of it, you know? And the rest of it is either not representing the opposing view in the way that they would accept, which I find to be the right way to do it. Like whether you think the way they represent themselves is fair or not, like at least if I'm representing someone and they disagree with me, I'd like to at least represent themselves in a way where they watched it and they said, "Yeah, that's what I think," you know, or it's close, at least. So I just I don't know. I feel like I had hopes for like Midnight Mormons, for example, to have on people that disagree with them a little bit.
Yeah.
And I haven't watched them for a long time, but they're pretty echo chambery. Um,
Yeah,
I feel like,
they even recorded some stuff with Jim Bennett that Jim wants them to publish that they haven't.
hmm,
So even with someone faithful like Jim Bennett, they haven't published some of
they
the
curate
things.
it so it's safe.
Yeah.
Um, Jacob Hansen, I think, does a better job than them. I really liked, I don't know, I'm trying to think. Well, he came onto my channel and let me ask him questions. I wasn't easy on him with everything.
He's a different person in person though, I think.
Um, Trying to think.
I mean, I think Cody's stuff is very interesting. Uber Mormon,
Yeah,
I
yep,
think Forrest's stuff is interesting.
yep.
Um, I think just like people are going to watch Carlson, even though they can just do simple checks to realize that most of the time he's spinning and lying. Like when he said that we were going to run out of diesel fuel, you know, as a country, and people were freaking out and going and filling up tanks of diesel fuel because they thought,
Oh no.
you know, that kind of stuff. But still, he gets lots and lots of views for his show.
Hmm.
So I
Well,
think
and I don't watch Fox that much, but I'll watch Daily Wire and it's just a lot of echo chambery stuff. Like that's just the best way I can describe it. Like, oh, do you know who I really like that's more in the conservative space and that's Amala? I can't even think of her last name, but she's on PragerU. Her stuff is I like her a lot. Probably because she sits where I'm at. She's not she doesn't participate in any religion and she's more conservative, so it's probably why I like her. Because
that makes sense.
because it's my echo chamber. So maybe that's um not really a good indicator of her being uh a good a good more less biased. It's just my bias. But anyways,
Yeah,
uh,
I don't know. I think Sam Harris, his making, do you subscribe to or listen to his Making Sense podcast?
I watch clips and stuff. I have not listened like consistently to anybody since I started working full time.
Hmm.
Like I'll catch stuff. Like even Jordan Peterson, I haven't listened to a full one of his newer podcasts for a long time. And I'm trying to think of some people that I've taken the time to listen to. I really like Michael Malice. He's been on in the political sphere. Um, yeah, I don't know. I'd have to go look at my YouTube history. I don't make it through like the long form ones anymore like I used to. Those are that's the better stuff, I think. But instead of those little 5 minute things that I don't know.
So, so to restate, you're saying that if there's lots of people that are going to go through a faith transition, that you think that there's going to be increasing environments in the little C church that are like what you're experiencing in your ward, what exists in my ward, even though neither of us are members. Um,
Yeah, I
and so
do
you'll
think
think
so.
there'll be more of that. Um, you think I'm putting
Well,
words in your mouth. There'll be more mentors because everyone's going to know someone that's gone through it that they can talk to on a local level.
not a mentor, but just some of those old ideas of just the way you would frame someone that happens to are gonna be obviously not true to a lot of people, so they're not gonna treat them like that, like that, like they just want to sin. That they're not gonna treat people like that as much, I don't think. I will say this though, as far as going back to the echo chambery thing,
Yeah. Yeah.
I I do think that uh the more echo chambery ex-Mormon content is, the less willing people are going to be to jump into that. And they are going to be more willing to hang out with the more nuanced people at church. If Does that make sense? Like as you become so flip-flopped and you can't say anything good about the church when someone's experiencing the good at church, it's going to fall flat for a lot of people that are going through a faith crisis. So they're not going to find a home in the ex-Mormon world either, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So yes, there's a lot of people that struggle finding a home at church, but they're going to jump online and watching people and they're going to be like, that's not it either. So I don't think a lot of people feel ministered to because of that.
Yeah. I think it depends on where they are in the point of their developmental experience. I mean, you alluded to this that perhaps a lot of what you experience is that you went through this during COVID.
Mm-hmm.
So you weren't raging, trying to go to church while wounded,
Mm-hmm.
and that affected your experience differently than someone who did it before or after, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a possibility for sure.
Huh.
That's maybe why I've been successful in maintaining those relationships is because I didn't burn any bridges. Didn't have a chance to.
So if you chose to only do a podcast a month or not create content anymore, would you still do the circles, the three
Yeah.
practices?
Well, there is something else I've kind of have a brainchild of, and that is to possibly do those circles and publish them. So the participants would have to be willing, and it's going to change the circle because the way they are now, people can talk freely and it stays in the room. I mean, you might have someone that says, oh, so and so said this, but it's just hearsay at that point, right? Like the recording is just for learning purposes. It won't be ever public. Um, so I've I've been tempted to have some kind of podcast where that audio is published and the participants are aware. I think you'd still get some really benefit. I think um, maybe it would be like not a good debate format, but like a good conversation format. I don't know. When you hear I'd be curious to know like 50,000 times in 1 hour, you just start saying it in every day. Like, hey, I'd be curious to know. I'd be curious to know. I don't know.
That's interesting. So are they
So,
open? Are they open to that?
well, I mean,
The
they don't
organization?
they don't I've talked to them about it. They don't own it and they're like, "Hey, if you want to do something like that, let us know and let us know if there's something we can do to help." I just I haven't decided how to do it. Like if I don't think where will you go is the right place for that because there's part of me that feels like things need to be organized in a way so that if someone wants to go through a binge of where will you go, they're kind of the same format and they're the same,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I don't want to throw in too many like, oh, this is I just don't want to make it too random. I want to keep it somewhat organized. So I don't know if I try to host it. I'm sure like Chris Hanna would let me do it on his channel. His is kind of random. Maybe he'd be okay with making it more random. But um, the other thing that I've wanted to do with Where Will You Go that I haven't taken the time or effort to set up is something like Pingburn did, but have it be virtual. Just having some conversations where people are ready for conversation, and I just be the
The
mediator.
moderator.
Yeah, just the organizer, setter, or maybe I get a third person to moderate. He didn't moderate him, he just set him up, got the
Yeah.
conversation going, thought, hey, this is a conversation I think people want to hear. And there's a lot of those in my head where I'm like, I think it'd be really cool to have this person talk to this person and get it set up and actually have a real conversation where we're not making I don't know. If I could find some people to be grown-ups and not
Yeah.
and not you know. So I thought of that too, and I just haven't set that up either. So it's not that I think that all content is terrible or that all ex-Mormon content is terrible. It's just I don't know. It's one of the worst things that I felt is just feeling this sense of like stuck. I'm not getting anything done. I'm not progressing toward anything. Now I'm not progressing toward eternal life. Now what am I doing? I'm just sitting here on YouTube watching this stuff. Like, I don't know. I think it's important to get outside and get some fresh air. I don't know how you encourage people to do that though, without, you know what I mean? Like, you're doing your
Yeah.
book club thing, and that's
Yeah.
probably a better use of your time than scrolling through
Yeah.
whatever the algorithm feeds you.
True. Yeah. This year I'll speak at 4 events. I'll speak at um, 3 Thrive events and then at Sunstone, hopefully. Um, and I find meaning in that because of the response that I get from the audience or the
Yeah,
feedback, the one-on-one conversations.
that's
I
cool.
find meaning in that. But I've semi-retired too, so I planned my whole life so by my current age I could go serve missions because of how I interpreted my patriarchal blessing.
We did
And
too.
oh, nice. So you
Well, we're not
understand
retired yet, but yeah, that was totally our life
that
goal.
was the life goal. Yeah.
Yeah.
So um, what I've decided is having learned from my financial planning clients, the entrepreneur types, the professional types, most of them don't do well retiring to straight leisure. They
Mhm.
they feel put out of use, and so um, the ones that go serve missions, multiple times, or have service opportunities in the church, they don't feel put out of use because that's how they create value or they
Mhm.
experience value creation. Um, but since that's not going to be me, um, I would follow my clients who decided at some point in their business to structure it so they could drop to half-time work and then work into their 80s and never fully retire.
Mm.
And so that's what I've decided to do. So,
That's
um,
cool.
yeah, thanks. So this year I dropped to half-time, um, which allows me to go camping, hiking, traveling with my wife, and allows me to spend more time in these kinds of conversations.
Mhm.
Uh, as long as there's not family things that come up,
Sure.
but which they do. Uh, and so, I mean, as long as I continue to feel like I'm creating value and that I have some sort of purpose, maybe that's what I'll participate in the conversations. But
Yeah.
I don't know what'll happen in the future. I mean, who knows? Maybe a
Right.
year from now, I'm ready to be an XX Mormon. I don't know.
Yeah. And I just want to give a disclaimer. I could just be projecting my things that bother me about myself onto everybody else in the world as far as like wasting time and just being sucked into the algorithm. So, like maybe this content's like way more helpful that I'm giving it credit for. So, there's that possibility.
Uh, yeah, I mean, for some people, it's very helpful.
Hmm.
I think what you're doing with the three practices is meaningful, at least for the people that are coming back, right?
Yeah. I've gotten a lot of feedback from other people that really appreciate me setting them up. And like for example, a lot of the refs, they truly want to be in the room with difference, but they don't get that chance very often. And a lot of times I will take 2 minutes just to balance the room out. I don't like doing that just because I feel like um I've really learned to enjoy just listening. And I've just learned that what I have to say isn't going to change anybody's mind. So it's like I don't really feel like I need to say it. I don't know. But a lot of people have thanked me and they're like, "Oh, really appreciate that. Like it was a good workout for me too." So I'm glad I can offer that to people, I guess. So